Peering behind the glass and crossing into uncharted territory, we aim to bring you closer to the absolute truth. Step into the past to witness the exact moments that shattered expectations.
Audience in the honest room. None of that means anything to me without verification. For all I know, you bought every single piece of what you're wearing from a military surplus store on the internet and put it on this morning. And this vehicle, registered to an Emmanuel Carvel. That you? Well, Emmanuel, I've got reason to believe this vehicle may have been involved in prior...
I'm done talking. Turn around and put your hands on the vehicle.
I have not committed any offense. I am not resisting. I want it noted that I am...
I said hands on the vehicle. Don't move. Don't turn around.
My hands are on the vehicle. I am not moving.
Give me your arm.
That is my shoulder. You are going to injure my shoulder.
Stop resisting.
I am not resisting.
You're being detained. Stop
Turn
talking.
your camera off if you want.
Officer Ethan Fisher thought the black man he pulled over on Highway 14 was going to be like every other stop he had conducted on that stretch of road. Cooperative, intimidated, and quickly forgotten. Instead, he got a Navy SEAL who knew his rights, refused an unlawful search, absorbed every escalation with the composure of a man trained to function under conditions far worse than a roadside stop, and lay on the road in handcuffs with the officer's slur still in the air above him, waiting for the backup that would end everything. What Ethan Fisher didn't know was that the officer pulling up behind him had served 2 years in a joint task force alongside the man on the ground, that the body camera timestamp showing exactly when it was turned off was already part of the legal record, and that the Navy SEAL lying on that road was already building the case that would send him to prison. Before we go further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. Here at JPTV, if you believe that a man who has spent his life defending this country deserves to drive down a public highway without being dragged out of his car and called the N-word, then hit that like button and subscribe. Because we tell the stories that the people responsible for them counted on never leaving the side of the road where they happened. Emmanuel Carvel was 36 years old and had spent 14 of those years inside the United States Navy. He had not arrived at the SEAL program through luck or convenience. He had arrived through a process that eliminates the vast majority of people who attempt it, a process designed specifically to find the point at which a person stops and then push them past it repeatedly until either the person is gone or the point no longer exists. Emmanuel had gone through that process at 22 and had come out the other side as someone the program considered worth keeping, which was its own kind of statement about the kind of man he was before the uniform ever touched his back. He had grown up in Harlow County in a neighborhood called the Caldwell District, in a 2-story house on Bracewell Street, where his mother taught secondary school mathematics, and his father managed the maintenance division of a mid-sized construction company on Industrial Parkway. They were not wealthy, but they were stable, and stability in the Caldwell District was its own form of achievement that both of his parents understood and had worked for, with the deliberate, unglamorous consistency of people who knew that the alternative was always closer than it looked. Emmanuel had been a focused child who became a focused teenager and then a focused young man, and the focus had a quality that his school coaches and his teachers had noticed and commented on independently of each other. Not the brittle intensity of someone trying too hard, but the settled, patient concentration of someone who had already decided where he was going and was simply executing the steps required to get there. He had enlisted at 21, spent his first year in the Navy on a conventional posting, and applied for the basic underwater demolition SEAL program at 22. The selection process lasted 6 months and included the infamous Hell Week, which is exactly what the name suggests, and which Emmanuel completed without ringing the bell that candidates ring when they are done. He had been assigned to SEAL Team 8, based out of Naval Amphibious Base Little Creek in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and had completed 4 overseas deployments in 14 years, 2 of them in active conflict zones in the Middle East, and 1 in a classified operational capacity that his service record referenced without detailing. He had been awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal and the Bronze Star with Valor, which is not a decoration given for participation. It is given for specific acts of courage under specific conditions that are documented and verified before the medal is authorized. And the conditions under which Emmanuel's had been authorized were the kind that most people do not encounter in a lifetime. On the afternoon of Thursday the 8th, he was driving north on Highway 14 in his personal vehicle. a navy blue Ford F-150 pickup registered in his name, insurance current, tags valid. He was in his Navy service uniform. The correct configuration cover on the passenger seat, decorations properly mounted on his left chest. He had come from a function at the Harlow County Veterans Affairs Office on Langton Street, where he had been a guest speaker at a recruitment information event for young people considering military service, and he was heading back toward the naval base, a drive of approximately 2 hours on Highway 14 north to the Interstate 9 connector. He had made the drive before. He had made it in uniform before. Neither of those facts would matter in approximately 40 minutes. Ethan Fisher was 33 years old and had been with the Harlow County Sheriff's Department for 7 years. He was assigned to the Highway 14 patrol corridor on the afternoon shift, a posting that covered the 30-mile stretch of the highway running through the county's western edge from the Aldgate Township boundary north to the Renfield District interchange. He was not, by any internal measure that his department tracked, a distinguished officer. His performance reviews described him as adequate, which is the word supervisors use when they cannot find anything specific to praise, and have decided that the absence of a disciplinary record is sufficient to constitute satisfactory service. He had one formal complaint in 7 years, filed by a black motorist on Highway 14 who had described the stop as racially motivated and had received a response from the department's complaint review office that used the words thoroughly investigated and no evidence of misconduct in its conclusion, which was the standard language of a process designed to reach a predetermined destination. He was parked in the lay-by at the 34-mile marker on Highway 14, partially obscured by the tree line that ran along the eastern shoulder, when Emmanuel's navy blue F-150 passed him at 3:47 in the afternoon. Fisher pulled out and ran the plates. The plates came back clean. He pulled out anyway and hit his lights at the 35-mile marker, and Emmanuel saw them in his mirror and felt the thing he had felt before on roads like this one. Not fear, because fear was not an emotion that the SEAL program left much room for, but a clear-eyed recognition of what was happening and a rapid, practiced assessment of how to move through it with the minimum cost to himself and the maximum preservation of his rights. He signaled and pulled to the shoulder at the 35.2-mile marker, a wide gravel section beside a weathered green mile marker post, and put the truck in park and placed both hands on the steering wheel in the visible, deliberate way that the situation required. He was a decorated Navy SEAL with 14 years of service and a Bronze Star with valor, and he placed his hands on the steering wheel of his own vehicle on the shoulder of a highway he had every right to be on, because that was the calculation that black men in this country make and had always made, regardless of what they had earned and regardless of what they were wearing when they made it. Fisher reached the driver's window and looked in. His eyes moved across Emmanuel in a single sweep. The uniform, the decorations, the cover on the passenger seat, and the expression that accompanied that sweep was not the expression of a man taking in new information. It was the expression of a man confirming something he had already decided. He asked for license and registration. Emmanuel provided both. Fisher took them back to his patrol car and sat in it for 4 minutes. When he came back, he had a quality in his walk that had not been there on the approach. Looser, more settled, the walk of a man who had decided on the drive back from his patrol car how the next portion of this stop was going to go. He told Emmanuel that the vehicle had come up with a flag in the system that he needed to investigate further. Emmanuel asked him what kind of flag. Fisher said he wasn't in a position to discuss the specifics. Emmanuel asked him what the flag related to. Fisher said it related to a prior incident associated with the vehicle's registration history and that he would need to conduct a search of the vehicle to complete his assessment. Emmanuel told him the vehicle had no prior incident history and that he did not consent to a search without probable cause. Fisher looked at him for a moment and then said, "The flag is probable cause." Emmanuel said, "A flag you cannot describe is not probable cause. I know my rights, and I am not consenting to a search." Fisher's expression changed. Not dramatically, not with any outward display of anger, but in the specific way that a man's expression changes when he has encountered a response he was not expecting and has decided that the response itself is the problem rather than examining whether the response is correct. He told Emmanuel to step out of the vehicle. Emmanuel asked him on what basis. Fisher said he was asking him to step out as part of the ongoing assessment of the vehicle flag. Emmanuel said that was not a legal basis for asking him to exit his vehicle and that he was going to remain where he was. Fisher stepped back from the window. He reached for his radio and called for a second unit, describing the situation as a non-compliant driver on Highway 14 at the 35.2-mile marker. He used the word hostile once in the radio call, which was the first deliberate untruth of the stop, but would not be the last. Then he came back to the driver's window and leaned against it and looked at Emmanuel in the uniform with the decorations on his chest and said, "You want to tell me where you actually got that outfit?" Emmanuel looked at him. He said, "I am Senior Chief Petty Officer Emmanuel Carvel, United States Navy SEAL, 14 years of service. This is my uniform, these are my decorations, and this is my vehicle. I have provided you with my license and my registration, and I have not violated any law on this highway today." Fisher looked at the decorations for a moment. Then he looked at Emmanuel and said, "Anybody can order that stuff online." Emmanuel said nothing. He looked at the road ahead through his windshield and waited for the backup that Fisher had just called, because he understood with the clarity of a man trained to assess situations accurately that the next several minutes were going to require everything he had, and he was not going to spend any of it on a response to a sentence that had just told him everything he needed to know about the man standing at his window. Fisher didn't wait for the backup to arrive before he decided the stop was going in a different direction. He stood at Emmanuel's window for another 30 seconds after the radio call, looking at the uniform, looking at the decorations, looking at Emmanuel's hands on the steering wheel, and then he told Emmanuel for the second time to step out of the vehicle. Emmanuel told him for the second time that he had no legal basis to make that request and that he was not going to comply with an unlawful instruction. Fisher told him that his continued refusal was being noted. Emmanuel said he understood that and remained exactly where he was. Fisher walked around the front of the truck slowly, the way a man walks when he wants the person watching him to understand that he is in no hurry and that the situation belongs to him regardless of how it develops. He went to the passenger side and tried the door. It was locked. He came back around to the driver's side and stood at the window again. And this time, his voice had dropped into something harder and more direct, the professional surface thinner now, what was underneath it closer to the top. He said, "Last time, step out of the vehicle." Emmanuel said, "I am a United States Navy SEAL in uniform on a public highway. I have committed no offense. I am not stepping out of this vehicle without a lawful reason to do so." Fisher reached through the open window. He did not ask again. He did not issue another warning. He reached through the window with both hands and grabbed Emmanuel by the collar of his uniform jacket and pulled. And the pull was not the pull of a man attempting to guide someone out of a vehicle, but the pull of a man who had decided that force was the appropriate response to refusal and was applying it without further deliberation. Emmanuel's training activated before his conscious mind had fully processed the decision. Not to resist in a way that would escalate, not to use the capabilities he had that would have ended the situation in a different direction entirely, but to manage the force being applied to him with the minimum physical response consistent with not being injured by it. He was out of the truck in 4 seconds, not because he had chosen to exit, but because a man with both hands in his collar had removed the choice. Fisher pushed him against the side of the truck and told him to place his hands behind his back. Emmanuel said, "I am not resisting. I am complying. I want you to note that I am complying." Fisher told him to stop talking. Emmanuel kept his voice level and continued, "I am Senior Chief Petty Officer Emmanuel Carvel. I am a decorated Navy SEAL. I am being detained without cause on a public highway. I want everything I am saying noted for the record." Fisher said, "I told you to stop talking," and pulled Emmanuel's right arm behind his back with a force that was beyond what the situation required and that Emmanuel felt in his shoulder in a way that would be documented by a physician 48 hours later. The cuffs went on. Fisher walked him to the front of the truck and pushed him down onto the road surface, face forward, and Emmanuel went down with the controlled, deliberate compliance of a man who had assessed the situation and determined that the ground was not the worst outcome available to him in the next 60 seconds. He lay on the road surface of Highway 14 at the 35.2-mile marker in his Navy service uniform with his decorations pressed against the asphalt, and his hands cuffed behind his back, and he breathed steadily, and he waited. Fisher stood over him. He looked down at the uniform, at the decorations visible even from above, at the cover that had come off during the removal from the vehicle and was lying on the gravel shoulder 6 feet away, and something moved across his expression that was not reassessment and was not doubt. It was something uglier than either of those things, and it had been present since the moment he looked through the driver's window and made his first decision about the man inside. He reached down and turned off his body camera. The timestamp on the device recorded the deactivation at 16:04 and 12 seconds, which meant the camera had been running for 11 minutes and 43 seconds from the moment Fisher had activated it at the start of the stop. The 11 minutes and 43 seconds of footage that existed would later become one of the most reviewed pieces of evidence in the case. The absence of footage after 16:04 and 12 seconds would become another. Fisher crouched down beside Emmanuel on the road surface. His voice was low, the kind of low that is not quiet but is choosing its volume deliberately because of who might be within earshot on a highway shoulder in the middle of the afternoon. He said the word. He said it the way a man says something he has been holding back and has now decided he no longer needs to hold back, which told Emmanuel that the decision to say it had not been impulsive, but had been sitting behind everything else in the stop, waiting for the moment the camera was off. Emmanuel said nothing. He lay on the road surface and breathed and looked at the asphalt in front of his face and filed every detail of the last 11 minutes and 43 seconds into the part of his mind where things are kept not for processing but for use, because he was a man who had been trained to function under conditions that would disable most people, and he understood that what was happening to him on this road was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something, and the beginning required him to be precise and to be patient and to be exactly where he was without spending anything he was going to need later. The backup unit appeared at the far end of the straight at 16:06. Emmanuel heard the engine before he saw the lights. He kept his face against the road and his breathing steady, and he waited for the car to reach the 35.2-mile marker, because whoever was in that car was about to become the most important person on this highway. And Emmanuel Carvel had not spent 14 years in the United States Navy learning to wait without also learning that what you wait for sometimes changes everything. The backup unit pulled onto the shoulder at 16:06 and 20 seconds, and Marcus Aldgate was out of the car before it had fully stopped moving. He was 39 years old and had been with the Harlow County Sheriff's Department for 11 years, and he had responded to Fisher's call the way any officer responds to a non-compliant driver call, with the assumption that the situation on the ground would match the description on the radio. He came around the front of his patrol car with his hand on his belt and his eyes already scanning the scene, and he saw Fisher standing on the shoulder and a man in uniform face down on the road surface in handcuffs, and he started walking toward them. He got within 10 feet before he stopped. He stopped because he had seen the uniform from a distance and had registered it as Navy and had kept walking, but at 10 feet the decorations were visible, and at 10 feet the specific configuration of those decorations produced a recognition that moved through him faster than a conscious thought. He looked at the Bronze Star. He looked at the Navy Commendation Medal beside it. He looked at the build of the man on the ground, the specific proportions of someone who had been built by a program that builds people in a particular way, and then he looked at the back of the man's head, and he said the name out loud before he had fully decided to say it. Emmanuel Carvel. It was not a question. Emmanuel turned his head from the road surface and looked at Marcus Aldgate from the ground with the same steady, unhurried expression he had been wearing since the stop began, the expression of a man who had been waiting for this moment with the patience of someone who knew it was coming and had decided exactly how he was going to be when it arrived. He said, "Marcus?" Just the name, nothing else. Marcus looked at Fisher. Fisher was looking back at him with the particular expression of a man who has just watched the ground shift beneath him and is trying to determine how far it has moved and in which direction. Marcus said, "You know who this is?" Fisher said he knew what the man had told him, and that the man had been non-compliant and hostile and had refused a lawful vehicle search. Marcus looked at him for a moment and then looked back at Emmanuel on the ground and said, "This is Senior Chief Petty Officer Emmanuel Carvel. He is a United States Navy SEAL. I served alongside him for 2 years in a joint task force out of Little Creek." He paused. "He has a Bronze Star with valor." Fisher said nothing. Marcus crouched down beside Emmanuel and looked at the cuffs and looked at Emmanuel's face and said quietly, "Are you injured?" Emmanuel said his right shoulder had been torqued during removal from the vehicle and that he had road abrasion on his left cheek from the surface contact. He said it the way he said everything, precisely, without drama, as a statement of fact for the record rather than a complaint. Marcus stood up and looked at Fisher and said, "Take the cuffs off." Fisher said the situation was still being assessed. Marcus said, "Take them off now." Fisher removed the cuffs. Emmanuel pushed himself up from the road surface and stood and straightened his uniform jacket and looked at the decorations on his chest, and then looked at Fisher with an expression that was not anger and was not satisfaction and was not anything that required a name. It was simply the expression of a man who had been told something he already knew and had now received the confirmation he had been waiting for. Marcus said, "His body camera is off." It was not a question either. He had noticed the indicator on Fisher's chest the moment he got close enough to see it. Fisher said he had experienced a technical issue during the stop. Marcus looked at him with the flat, final expression of a man who has been in law enforcement for 11 years and knows exactly what a technical issue looks like and knows exactly what this was instead. He said nothing further on the subject. He took out his own notebook and looked at Emmanuel and said, "I need everything, from the beginning." Emmanuel told him everything. He told it in sequence with timestamps where he had them and approximate times where he didn't, and he told it in the same level, unhurried voice he had been using since Fisher first appeared at his window, because he had been storing it precisely for this moment, and not a detail had been lost. When he finished, Marcus looked at his notes and then looked at Fisher standing on the shoulder of Highway 14 with the empty cuffs in his hand and the body camera dark on his chest, and said nothing. Fisher looked at the road. There was nothing on the road that was going to help him. Marcus Aldgate filed his supplementary incident report before the end of his shift that evening. He filed it in full, without omission, and he filed it knowing exactly what it was going to do to the case that Fisher had been constructing on the side of Highway 14 for the last 20 minutes of his career. He documented the position of Emmanuel on the ground when he arrived. He documented the visible decorations and his personal identification of the subject. He documented the body camera indicator being dark on Fisher's chest. He documented Fisher's explanation of a technical issue and noted, in the flat language of an experienced officer writing something that is going to be read in a courtroom, that the indicator showed no sign of malfunction and that the deactivation appeared deliberate. He signed the report at 1822 and submitted it through the department's standard reporting system, where it was received, logged, and immediately flagged for supervisory review. Emmanuel went directly from the highway to the Harlow County Medical Center on Fenwick Road, where a physician documented a strained right shoulder consistent with forceful arm manipulation, road abrasion on his left cheek consistent with prolonged contact with a rough surface, and contusions on both wrists consistent with tight restraint application. The physician completed the documentation with the thoroughness of someone who understood, from the nature of the injuries and the identity of the patient, that the medical record was going to be evidence before very long. Emmanuel thanked her, collected copies of everything, and drove to his attorney's office on Whitmore Avenue, where he sat down at a desk and began the process of turning the last several hours into the most precisely documented legal case he was capable of constructing. His attorney was a man named Desmond Price, who had been practicing civil rights litigation for 20 years, and who, when Emmanuel finished laying out the sequence of events in full, sat back in his chair and said nothing for a moment. Then he said that the body camera timestamp was the most significant single piece of evidence he had encountered in a case of this kind in several years, because it did not require interpretation. It showed exactly when the camera was turned off, and it showed that the camera was turned off before the slur was used, and before the most significant physical contact of the stop, which meant that Fisher had not made an impulsive decision in a difficult moment. He had made a calculated one. That distinction, Desmond said, was the difference between misconduct and something considerably more serious. The Internal Affairs investigation was open within 48 hours of Marcus's report being flagged. The body camera footage from the first 11 minutes and 43 seconds of the stop was reviewed in full and showed Fisher's demeanor, his language, his approach to Emmanuel's credentials, and the moment he reached through the window. All of it documented, all of it inconsistent with the report Fisher had filed, describing a hostile and non-compliant subject who had necessitated physical intervention. The gap after 16:04 and 12 seconds was itself treated as evidence, because a body camera does not turn itself off, and the department's technical team confirmed within 72 hours that Fisher's device showed no malfunction before or after the deactivation. Fisher was suspended with pay on the third day. He was terminated on the 14th following the conclusion of the Internal Affairs review, which found that he had conducted a stop without reasonable cause, used excessive force during the removal of the subject from the vehicle, deliberately deactivated his body camera during an active enforcement encounter in violation of department policy, and used racially derogatory language toward the subject while the camera was off, as confirmed by the testimony of the backup officer who had arrived in time to hear the word "still in the air" when he reached the scene. The termination letter listed all 4 findings. It was 2 pages long, and it was final. The criminal charge came 6 weeks later. The district attorney's office, having reviewed the full investigative record including Marcus's report, the medical documentation, the body camera footage, and the technical team's findings on the deactivation, filed a charge of civil rights violation under federal statute. It was not a charge that departments or prosecutors file lightly because it requires a specific evidentiary threshold, and the threshold in this case had been met with room to spare. Fisher was arrested, processed, and released on bail, and his attorney released a statement saying that his client intended to contest the charges vigorously, which was the statement his attorney was obligated to release, and which nobody who had read the evidence found particularly credible. Emmanuel's civil suit was filed the same week as the criminal charge. Desmond Price filed against Fisher personally and against the Harlow County Sheriff's Department for the prior complaint that had been investigated and closed without consequence, arguing that the department's failure to act on documented prior behavior had created the conditions for what happened on Highway 14. The prior complaint, which had been filed by a black motorist and resolved with the standard language of no evidence of misconduct, was now being read in a very different context, and in that context it looked exactly like what it was. Fisher was convicted on the federal civil rights charge 11 months after the stop. He was sentenced to 14 months in a federal correctional facility. The civil suit settled 2 months before the criminal verdict, with terms that included full financial restitution for Emmanuel's medical costs, legal costs, and damages, as well as a formal written acknowledgement from the department that the stop had been conducted without legal basis, and that the force used had been excessive and unjustified. The acknowledgement was 1 paragraph long, and it had taken 11 months and a federal conviction to produce. But it existed, and it was signed, and it was part of the permanent record. Emmanuel returned to active duty at Naval Amphibious Base Little Creek. He completed his next deployment, his 5th, and came back from it the same way he had come back from the others, intact, focused, and ready for whatever came next. He drove Highway 14 again the following spring, the same route, the same truck, the same uniform on the passenger seat, because he had a function at the Veterans Affairs office on Langton Street and had decided to drive down the night before. He passed the 35.2-mile marker at 3:50 in the afternoon, roughly the same time of day, and he noted it the way a trained man notes a location that has significance in his personal history. Without sentiment, without drama, and without slowing down. He had work to get to. He always did. If you made it to the end of this story, then you already know why it needed to be told. A man who spent 14 years defending this country was dragged out of his car, put on the ground, and called the worst word in the English language by someone who turned his camera off first because he knew exactly what he was about to do. Share this video, put it in front of someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to JPTV, because we are not done. The end.
The precise records of our past hold the essential narratives that define our present reality. To deeply understand these narratives is to search for the absolute truth. Thank you for sharing in our steadfast commitment to uncover what truly happened.